Hey, hi everyone again. Welcome to the Information Literacy Mailbag, which is this month's Edie and Neil's book club event produced by ALA Editions. We're going to try to keep this program briskly substantive by answering audience questions via the written Q&A function here in Zoom throughout the hour and by taking other live questions from the audience here and there after each presentation. We'll get started with our first presenter in the next few seconds. It is actually a duo, Lauren Kehoe and Julie Hornick, who are the authors of the forthcoming Critical Information Literacy Applications for All Libraries, which will be shipping very shortly. Welcome, Lauren and Julie.
Thank you so much.
So hi, my name is Julie Hornick. I am head of library instruction and a senior instructional services librarian at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lauren Kehoe, head of research engagement, also in Florida at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. And I'm going to get us kicked off with our first question. So Julie and I are here today because we did edit a book on critical information literacy for all libraries. And the first question I have for Julie is, why should information literacy programs promote critical thinking about systems of power rather than simple source evaluation?
So I think this is a great starting point because what we consider traditional source evaluation, that is looking at things like currency or authority, that can be helpful, but I think it misses the bigger picture. Because when we ask who has the power to publish, whose knowledge is being valued, we're looking at the systems that shape the information we consume. And this matters because systemic inequalities impact who gets access to information and who gets to be heard. Helping students and patrons see these dynamics opens up space to identify gaps like what voices are missing and why. And this deepens our patrons, our students' understanding of just how complex information creation really is. And it helps them to be more thoughtful and critical in how they navigate that world. So this leads into our second question. Why should we teach patrons to question why and how information is created and who benefits from it?
Thanks, Julie. And as Julie said, teaching about this opens up space to identify gaps, like what voices are missing and why, which allows for a more critical dialogue around the bias in information, the economics of information creation, and can lead to a more meaningful understanding of our information ecosystem. As we posited in our book's introduction, critical information literacy asks us to interrogate underlying algorithmic biases and address the underrepresentation of marginalized voices. It further encourages us to question who creates information and who controls its dissemination, and to question the assumption of information neutrality. In sum, critical information literacy provides a framework for moving beyond a traditional skills-based information literacy approach and toward a more socially conscious and critically engaged practice. So I have the next question, and it's why should I or my students learn about critical information literacy when all I want is for me or them to learn how to use library resources?
So, as an instructional librarian in higher education and having spent 13 years as a public school librarian in middle and elementary schools, I really get this question. Professors and school teachers have a limited amount of time to get through a certain amount of content. And public library patrons, they have limited time to learn how to navigate a database. So, learning the tools feels urgent. But really, critical information literacy isn't something extra. It actually gives meaning to our use of the tools. It helps students and patrons understand just why certain information even exists, who created that information, and how systems of power determine what we as information users consider authoritative. Understanding that leads to a more thoughtful research process, more engaged learners. I think, in short, more empowered thinkers. So instead of just retrieving sources, students and patrons begin to question them and to contribute their own perspectives. In the end, it's really about learning to think, not just search. And this is how patrons, students become not just users, but effective users of information. So, how can we develop practices? What practices can we create in our instruction to help patrons and students to question dominant narratives?
Thanks, Julie. I really love this question. One of my favorite practices in the instruction that I do is to open up the session by asking students what they want to know, as well as ask them where they go for information. I tell them I have a whole lot of things I want to show and discuss, but I ask them first so that they can learn from each other about where they find the information. I also tell them that nothing is off the table. Do they use Wikipedia? Do they use AI tools? How about social media? So I say, yes, we're in the library. And of course, we're going to dive into and look at the library resources, but I want to know how they get their information. If it's at the reference desk, I ask them where they've been searching already and what their information journey has been. For me, this really sets the scene to bring their voices and methods for locating and using information, and we can build from there. We can build upon that information, what information sources they're using, and I can show them what else might be available or discuss what might be available. I just wanted to also share some of the contributors in our book have offered some suggestions for incorporating alternative types of resources in their instruction, like zines. We worked with a contributor who had a substantial zine collection. And then after introducing the collection and talking about the value of zines, they have the students work together to create zines and publish materials themselves. Another contributor offered some ways to incorporate aspects of algorithmic bias in their instruction. And furthermore, another contributor states that they select subject terms and examples that center marginalized identities when they're showing kind of how to do searches in the various library resources. They'll also talk about controversial topics and searching for information around topics such as racial justice, disability rights, or indigenous knowledge during their instruction. With the next question, I'd like to know how we can make space for inquiry, uncertainty, and dialogue in our instruction.
So I think that the first thing that we need to do is to really get comfortable moving away from black and white or right and wrong answers. In other words, we need to get away from asking, is this source good or bad, to more open-ended exploration, because students and patrons can learn to recognize that their questions are valid, even if they don't have really neat answers. And we can do this by designing learning experiences that allow for reflection, for discussion, and for curiosity. So, inquiry-based activities, journaling, think, pair, share discussions, just to name a few, can help show students that their questions matter when they're doing research. When they see that they have a voice, I think that they're likely to engage more deeply. So that kind of leads into, how can we center the lived experiences and cultural knowledge of our patrons in our programming and services?
Thanks, Julie. My response would be that librarians can adopt pedagogical approaches that validate and incorporate real-world experiences into learning environments. We can create spaces where real-world experiences are acknowledged as valid and essential to the learning experience. Bell Hook's feminist pedagogy, as discussed in our book, encourages educators to build instruction around the realities and identities of learners. It fosters a more inclusive and caring environment. Within public libraries, they can adopt a more community-led programming opportunity that reflects the cultural and informational needs of their patrons. Some examples would be workshops on social media manipulation or book groups focused on social justice. These approaches not only validate our patrons' knowledge and our students' knowledge, but also empower them to critically engage with the information landscape. So our next question is, in what ways can we empower patrons to be creators, not just consumers of information?
Well, I think that so often students think of research as reading and then reporting on what so-called experts have to say. But critical information literacy can help them to see that they have voices too. In other words, they have experiences and perspectives that they can bring to the table. And as librarians, we can help them to share their own stories or insights with a number of activities, such as zine workshops, where they can learn that their personal stories matter, or a Wikipedia edit-a-thon, where they learn that they can actually shape the information that others will use in their research, or something like community archiving that shows that their friends, their families, and their own personal lived experiences are worth preserving. So instead of just taking in what others have written, they learn to ask, what do I know about this? What's my experience? What can I add? Critical information literacy helps our students, it helps our patrons to recognize that they really do have a valid place in the conversation surrounding information and information creation. And so this kind of leads into our final question here. How can we move from a checklist-based model of evaluation like CRAP to one that fosters critical inquiry?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, librarians have a lot to cover in their typical what's called one-shot instruction that we do. But we can still share the rubrics such as CRAP as a resource, but also allow for more dynamic conversations about this bias and privilege in our classrooms. We can introduce frameworks such as ACT UP, which emphasizes authority, currency, truth, bias, and privilege. These models encourage students to reflect on the power structures behind information creation and dissemination, rather than simply ticking off surface level criteria. Instructional strategies like guided discussions, collaborative analysis of real world sources, and reflective questioning, for example, who benefits from this information or what perspectives are missing, help learners develop deeper evaluative skills. By shifting the focus from correctness to context, librarians empower patrons to engage with information as active critical thinkers. Thank you.
And so to wrap up, with theory, larger programmatic ideas, professional development, and adaptable lesson plans, we think that our book will help you to answer the questions that we've asked here, and even harder questions that students and patrons as researchers will find about the information landscape. And it will help you to empower your communities to do the same. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie and Lauren. We do have a few questions in the chat. I'll start with one that seems to be a yes or no question. Is this book for all levels of libraries or college levels, referring to critical information literacy applications for all libraries?
I think we really made that effort when we were soliciting submissions and deciding on what chapters would go in. So I think each of the authors has written from their own perspective, and we have voices of elementary or school librarians, public librarians, academic librarians, but they've really made the effort to show how what they do can be adapted for other levels. So I wrote from an academic level, but here are some adaptations, or this is the way you can adapt it for your situation in the public library or in a school library.
Wonderful. Another question, how do we determine the best information literacy framework to use for teaching information literacy?
It's a great question, right? And there's a fair amount of them out there. So, I mean, again, maybe the context of your particular situation or the context of the particular kind of lesson, you know, and I don't think there's one that's the best. And it's part of that information literacy building is to kind of understand the frameworks and use them across the different questions that were asked.
Next question from Madeline Ruggiero. What do you think of the SIFT method for evaluating online information, SIFT method?
I have not personally used SIFT, but I have seen presentations on it, and I absolutely see the validity there. I don't know, Lauren, have you worked with SIFT?
I haven't either, afraid to say. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for that either.
Madeline, if you have thoughts of your own, I'm sure you do about it, please feel free to share it in the chat, and the audience will appreciate that. Question from Melanie Lejeune. Are you familiar with Project Look Sharp from Ithaca College? They have a great questioning strategy for media literacy.
Project Look Sharp. No, again, I'm not familiar with that. At Ithaca College, is that correct?
Mhm.
Yeah. I feel another book in the works here with all the different frameworks to to support this. I'm not familiar
Yeah,
with
and
it
it might
either.
be a reference in some of our other media literacy titles, but Melanie, if you want to share more information about that in the chat, we welcome that as well. And then our last question from Julie Goldberg is, could you please contextualize your argument in terms of what some people are calling our epistemic collapse? And if you're
Yeah.
unable to answer live, we can always have a robust discussion in the chat while the presentations are ongoing, or you can use Julie and Lauren's email addresses and discuss further that way. But
Yeah.
thanks again so much, Lauren and Julie. Wonderful presentation. And next up, we have Amanda Nichols Hess with her presentation about information literacy and critical thinking using perspective transformation to break information bubbles, which is due to ship late this month, I believe. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, Ramon. I almost did the thing where I started talking and was muted. I don't know why I'm still doing this 5 years into Zoom, but as Ramon mentioned, I'm Amanda Nichols Hess. My forthcoming book is Information Literacy and Critical Thinking Using Perspective Transformation to Break Information Literacy Bubbles. And so I'm excited to share some of the essential ideas in this book with you all today. So in this book, I use transformative learning theory as a lens to consider information literacy instruction and critical thinking. So I wanted to start by addressing what is transformative learning theory. So it is an adult learning theory that was first developed by Jack Mesereau out of Teachers College at Columbia University in the 1970s. And since then, it's been researched and written about in many different contexts. But there are some central ideas that I think may resonate with some of us. So its central concepts are that adults can often hold or even espouse beliefs or opinions that they've not fully considered, or that they've unintentionally adopted, maybe from childhood, maybe from experiences as a younger person. And these beliefs, opinions, and then their subsequent actions may be in conflict with how individuals actually see themselves or think about themselves, think about their place in society more broadly, and then also think about the world more generally. But when we acknowledge, examine, and revise how we think and how we act to ensure that our mindsets are in line with our values, we engage in what Mesereau called transformative learning, and we experience what he called perspective transformation. So Mesereau said that transformative learning happens through a series of phases toward this idea of perspective transformation. And these stages build on each other, but people don't necessarily move through them in a straight line. So somebody might stop, stall out, regress at any point in time. But the phases involve ideas that you might recognize. So they start with this idea of experiencing a disorienting dilemma, which leads to engaging in self-examination and critically assessing one's own assumptions. This is followed by recognizing that others have had similar experiences of disorientation and self-examination, and that there are options for behavior or action that we might pursue to express to a changed mindset or be more authentic in how we express what we think and what we believe. From exploring these actions, these options for action, we can develop plans of action, which then necessitate acquiring the necessary skills and knowledge to make those plans a reality. Once we've acquired those skills and knowledge, we try on new roles, we integrate feedback that we receive in such trials into our actions and into our practices. which allows us to develop competence, confidence, and relationships based around our new ways of thinking, our more authentic ways of thinking. And then we can fully integrate our changed perspectives into how we interact with others in society. Just those simple steps, right? Just very easy and straightforward. I'm kidding, of course. So you might be thinking, why in the world is this way of thinking about adult learning relevant to library workers, especially those of us who are interested in information literacy? Well, people tend to search for information and select information sources that confirm what they already think or believe. And this tendency can create or reinforce information bubbles. So if people are seeking information that confirms unexamined existing beliefs and attitudes, they maybe are detrimentally impacting how they understand the world and how they see themselves as fitting into it. So the idea of transformative learning and this practice perhaps of perspective transformation can offer us structures that we can use to foster critical thinking with people around how to consider, how to search for, how to find, how to evaluate, and how to use information sources. And if we can foster that critical thinking, we may be able to start helping learners to expand their perspectives and to pop those information bubbles. So that's some very high level context about transformative learning theory, but critical thinking is another important factor, both in how we think about our work and how learners think about information. And so in thinking about critical thinking, along with transformative learning theory, the other set of ideas that my book uses to frame the concepts and how we might go about perspective transformation are the ideas of critical librarianship, critical pedagogy, and critical information literacy. These are all ways of thinking and acting that we can use in our own work to create situations where others might engage in those practices of critical thinking. And these are practices that can help us to think more critically as well. But how do these ideas connect to transformative learning theory? So how do these ideas work together in meaningful ways for us? So if we use critical practices in our library work, in our pedagogical practices, or in framing how we think about information literacy, we can, in the words of the ACRL Instruction Section's Research and Scholarship Committee, expose and question the historical, political, and social bases for our assumptions and our practices. So in this explanation, we can see two important terms that connect to the ideas that I've just shared with you about transformative learning theory: our assumptions and our practices. So if we question our assumptions as well as our practices, we can think more critically about how we're thinking and how we're acting, and then we can change our perspectives as well as how we behave, which can affect our learners' learning experiences. But why do these ideas matter to library workers, either on their own as separate concepts or in connection to each other? Perspective transformation is a highly individual experience, so it's not something that we can force others through as much as we might want to. And the same can be said for critical thinking. We can't make individuals critically consider the systems and structures in which information exists, nor can we make people evaluate the information that they encounter. But what we can do, and we can use, I argue, we can use these ideas of transformative learning theory and critical practices to create conditions in which learners can consider their mindsets or behaviors, or foster opportunities where folks can examine how information is created or what makes information valuable in different contexts, or the systems that we use to access and share ideas, for example. So if we're interested in creating these kinds of conditions, we can begin by looking at the ways in which we engage with learners and finding places to embed such experiences in those interactions. So this might mean that we are working with learners or individuals in workshops or in instruction that happens in the context of a class, or even in just one-on-one meetings or one-on-one interactions with folks. So in these settings, where do people experience confusion, or where do we find that our patrons or our learners are experiencing dissonance or disorientation, especially around the information they're encountering or they're finding? Where are those times that people might find what they expect is not actually what they experience? And these are starting points or places where we might create structures where learners can deal with these experiences in productive and helpful ways. So these are places, if we can identify these spots, where we can start to plant the seeds of critical thinking, to encourage critical thinking and promote perspective transformation. So that's how we think about other learners or the learning experiences we are creating for other folks. But we can also think about this in the context of ourselves and our own practices, how we think about our work as librarians, or how we think about library work more generally, as well as how we just approach our work with other people. If this is still highly personal, of course, but I think it's a little bit easier because we're more in control of the main variable, which is the person experiencing or questioning their own thinking. So if we can consider events in our working lives in light of the 10 phases of perspective transformation, we may be able to see opportunities that exist where we can grapple with concepts that we find challenging or uncomfortable. And the phases of perspective transformation can help us to facilitate our own critical thinking in constructive ways. So I realize this is very academic, can be kind of high level. So I'm going to make it a little more concrete. And I think this is one thing that's valuable about my book, is that there are examples of how transformative learning and critical information literacy, critical thinking practices have shown up in my practices weaved throughout the text. I highlight the phases of transformative learning and critical information literacy in really concrete ways in 2 examples from my teaching, an example from instructional design work, and an example from a more programmatic experience. So no matter where you are approaching information literacy or library instruction from as an instructor, or someone who's doing design work, or someone who maybe is managing a program, there are hopefully examples that will resonate with you or can kind of make these concepts a little bit more concrete. I'm going to share one of those examples from my teaching, and this is an example pulled from the text, but I'm talking about it in much less depth, of course. So there's much more detail and it's more fleshed out in the narrative. But I hope that this will give you a sense of how these ideas can concretely be experienced or be expressed in people's practices. So this will walk us through the 10 phases of perspective transformation. So bear with my animation a little bit here. Hopefully it makes sense. So after many years of teaching in the same classes in the same ways, I found that it didn't work for me anymore. My instructional approach and even the ideas I was sharing with learners or asking learners to engage with did not line up with how I would define my teaching philosophy. So I knew that I should be challenging learners more, emphasizing critical thinking more, and creating those moments of disorientation for them. But I found myself doing a lot of pointing and clicking instead. And so this is an example of that disorienting dilemma, which often happens by what's called accretion, or the gradual buildup over time. It can also happen through an epochal event, like a big seismic change. But Mesereau and most of the researchers around transformative learning theory find that most of us experience disorientation gradually and then suddenly, just like I did in this instance. So with this disorienting dilemma, the dilemma piece is, are we going to do anything about it? Am I going to ignore this disorientation I was feeling and move on with life as is? Or am I going to examine my beliefs and my actions against how I truly thought about myself and how I saw the world? And that's much harder. So in my instance, I chose to do something. And this is the decision which led to the subsequent phases of perspective transformation that I experienced. So I began by engaging in self-examination. In this case, was I practicing what I preached around what meaningful learning experiences should look like? And this was a big fat no. Because my practices were not in line with how I thought about myself, I experienced the 3rd phase of perspective transformation, which is alienation. In many instances, of course, this alienation might be from other people or groups in which we thought ourselves to be a member. But in this case, I was really experiencing a disconnect between how I presented myself as an educator outwardly and how I was actually practicing. But I moved through this sense of alienation by connecting with others' discontent. In this case, it happened online. This was, connecting with others who we know can be helpful, but I'll be honest, I was embarrassed and I didn't want to confess to my colleagues that I was struggling. So I looked online to online spaces like ALA Connect and instruction-focused listservs, and this helped me to see that I wasn't alone and that other people were grappling with the same kinds of questions and dealing with being authentic in their instruction. So such connection led to the next 2 phases, which involve exploring options, which I did in those same online venues, as well as in other places like the community of online research assignments and the ACRL framework sandbox. Here I could see how others had dealt with integrating critical concepts in various settings, and I was able to take this and move toward planning courses of action. I was really focusing on figuring out how I could move from transactional instructional interactions or transactional approaches to one that was more relational, more effective, and that was more considerate of who my students were and the kinds of interactions that would be most meaningful to them. Then we move into the next phases of developing knowledge and skills and provisionally trying out new approaches. For me, that development involved revising instructional content, both the materials I used and the things that were student facing, like guides or handouts. And the provisional trying out was mostly done for me in the privacy of my own office so that I could work through my own embarrassment and become accustomed to a new way of doing things in a way that allowed me to have some trial and error on my own. From this came building confidence and competence and negotiating relationships in light of shifts in thinking and action. And this is where I had to actually do the thing. I taught using new approaches, using new resources with a changed mindset. And although it was certainly not perfect, I used these experiences and the feedback I received to reflect on what it meant for me to be authentic in my work and to work with students in a more, like I said, relational and connecting focused way. Negotiating the relationships involved reframing my interactions with subject faculty around working with more critical concepts in their classes, which meant asserting myself as more of an equal and an instructional expert in my own right. It's important to note I had to also figure out in what context this worked and what context it didn't work. There were and are some interactions that are still more transactional, and that's okay. So finally, the last phase of perspective transformation is reintegration. And in my example, this is my reintegration with a changed mindset about my teaching and my values and practices in alignment, but with the acknowledgement of the constraints in my situation. So that's just an example of how perspective transformation and critical practices have impacted me and my work, and I think impacted the students with whom I work as well. So if this is interesting to you, of course, I encourage you to take a deeper look. But I'll conclude by considering what we might ask ourselves if we want to more intentionally consider transformative learning and critical information literacy in our own practices. In the book, each chapter concludes with questions for reflection. So here's a selection that I thought might be pertinent to leave you with today. So where can you create moments of disorientation for students in instruction? What systems, structures, or power dynamics need to be uncovered, and what actions can you take to help uncover them? How can you prompt learner self-examination and support learners through feelings of alienation in online learning environments, especially those that are asynchronous? And how can you build learners' confidence and competence in the information landscape where we live now? And what role have relationships building played in impacting learners' perspective transformations that you've seen? So I thank you for your time. I hope these questions and my example have piqued your interest about how you can think about information literacy and critical thinking in your own practices.
Thank you so much, Amanda. We do have 3 questions here in the chat. The first one is, how do we effectively incorporate AI literacy into critical information literacy? And you can just share any thoughts you have on that.
Sure. I mean, I think that is challenging, but I think there are a number of points of connection, especially if we're thinking about systems and structures, right? It's important, I think, to emphasize the systems and structures around which generative AI tools are built. I think that's a real point that we've found, that I found in working with learners, is actually, I think, a much more natural point of critical thinking sometimes than information is, because as the previous presenters mentioned, a lot of times we think of research as I'm going to regurgitate what the experts have shared, whereas AI literacy and critical thinking around AI, I think we're like, well, what are these tools and how are they created? And how are they learning, and whose voices are being heard and who's maybe not being heard. So I actually think there are some really interesting ways that sort of the unknown around AI allows us to connect with critical thinking there. I realize that's kind of an incomplete answer, but I really think that AI as a tool, people have a lot of questions, and I think capitalizing on those questions give us opportunity for critical thinking, and hopefully prompting some critical thinking with our students around those tools.
Agreed. And we have another question that is about a resource entitled for misunderstanding how approaches to teaching digital literacy make students susceptible to scammers, rogues, bad actors, and hate mongers by Weinberg, Brickstone, Zeven Smith. In this title, they strongly urge people to cut the CR at double AP. Colleges and universities must make sure that they are not doing harm by dispensing guidelines that make students susceptible to misinformation. The basic assumptions of the CR double AP test are rooted in an analog age. Websites are like print texts. The best way to evaluate them is to read them carefully. But websites are not variations on print documents. The internet operates by wholly different rules. Any thoughts, Amanda, on that quote share?
I'm not familiar with the resource, but I certainly agree and have seen and engaged with many thoughts about how the CRAP test, other checklists are exactly what that quote describes, right? Made for an analog age, and that we're limiting our students, we're limiting learners, we're limiting the individuals with whom we work if we are just, representing that as comprehensive. So I think getting whoever, right? You don't just want to say learners, because I know some people who are not in educational settings who could use some critical thinking about online materials that they're encountering. But asking those critical questions, prompting people to engage with, disorientation or discomfort around information sources, I think, in my opinion, is more productive than CRAP tests and checklists. And yes, that's very uncomfortable. That's much harder than a checklist. I prefer a checklist myself. So while I'm not familiar with that work, I think agree. And I think many of us have experienced that in many sectors and facets of our lives, both professional and personal. And so I think the more we can push back against those, the more critically we're going to be able to think ourselves, and the more critically the learners with whom we work will be able to think as well. So definitely something that I'm interested in and would look into. So thanks for that resource information.
Great. I have another question, and this person says, I see your email address. It's Oakland College. Is it? They asked where you work, and if you could share that.
Yep, I work at Oakland University, which is not in California. It's in Rochester, Michigan. So please feel free. Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to reach out, and I'm on email all the time. So.
There we go. And then our last question is really intended for the previous presenters, but you can chime in as well if you would like. We are interested in assessing and benchmarking our students' skills to assist with curriculum planning and scaffolding, and to provide data to back up our information literacy teaching efforts. Is there an assessment tool that others have used successfully for these purposes?
So the only one that I'm familiar with is the threshold assessment. I think TATIL is the acronym, but assessment is something that I wish I could do more of at my institution. I'll say more in the chat so that I can turn it over to our next presenters. But if anyone hears of anything, I would be interested in learning as well. So great question, but I'll stop sharing now and let our other presenters take over.
Yeah, and Julie and Lauren, you can also answer in the chat that question from Mary Fraser as well. I will copy it over for everybody to be able to see it there too. So again, thanks so much, Amanda. Next up, we have Paul Jaeger and Natalie Green-Taylor, who are the authors of Foundations of Information Policy and of Literacy.
All right. I don't know why it's doing the presenter mode. Sorry, everyone. Thought I had this all straightened out. Okay, here we go. So hi, my name is Natalie Taylor. I'm here. Paul Jaeger will jump in toward the end of this presentation. But we co-wrote the Foundations of Information Literacy textbook, which we considered to be a foundational text on what information literacy is, the history of the term, why it matters to us as librarians, and how all of the different events that are going on in the world contribute to information literacy and how it is perceived. So I'll go through just a few questions that hopefully represent the I guess, breadth of information we have in the book. The first is information literacy? Well, if it is such an important practice, then why is the term so ambiguous? And there's a few reasons for that. One is that it is difficult to define both information and literacy. Information can be data, bits in a computer passed between in a technological method, or it can actually be, you know, messages and communications that have been passed between people that are prone to bias and cultural interpretations and things of all of that nature. So, you know, it depends on what you're talking about when you're talking about information. And then defining literacy itself at its very base level is, you know, just the ability to understand someone else's message, right? But there's so many other literacies that go into basic literacy, and that involves things like data literacy, scientific literacy, health literacy, and on and on and on. So once you get into what you're talking about as understanding literacy and what you're talking about as understanding information, then it's pretty easy to see why information literacy can be ambiguous. Additionally, the history of the term has heavily impacted how people both in and out of our field view what IL is. Some of the previous presenters have mentioned this, that because it was sort of developed in a skills-based model as preparation for employment, as a higher education tool to demonstrate what academic libraries are doing, this sort of checklist or skills-based approach has infused what people understand about the term. And I do think that, again, as other presenters have mentioned, it does limit the way that we understand training and education around information literacy. So in the book, we actually we came up with a definition after a lot of back and forth, and you can see it here, that information literacy is a constantly refined practice of processing, accessing, understanding, critically evaluating, and using information in ways that are relevant to one's life. Information literacy relies on a social structure that promotes the agency of individuals in their communities and in the legal, political, educational, communication, and economic structures in their lives. Practicing information literacy is an iterative learning process that occurs throughout an individual's lifetime. And I want to draw particular attention to that last sentence, because I think that's one of the main points of emphasis that we really want to get across in this book, is that information literacy is not a static state of being. You cannot be an information literate person. Rather, information literacy is something that you practice. And so, like with these checklist models, you can't say, oh, I'm done. I've accomplished all that I need to learn in my quest to be information literate. It's something that every time you interact with information, you have to understand what you're doing and through that lens of information literacy. Additionally, throughout an individual's lifetime is equally as important, because so often we talk about higher education, we talk about K-12 education as the means in which information literacy is taught. But public libraries are doing a whole lot in this space, and I actually think could do more. We just aren't calling it that necessarily. And so expanding the definition and expanding our understanding of how information literacy can be learned and can be used throughout the lifetime is really critical to improving. So, you know, speaking of training, we asked, what kind of information literacy training should MLIS students get? And the reason I put this question in here is because Paul and I are both, we're both professors in MLIS programs, and both of us have been part of developing coursework for information literacy. And it did make us both really it made it very obvious that although information literacy is frequently woven into and mentioned in courses, there's not a whole lot of focus specifically on information literacy as a topic. And given how critical it is to what librarians are doing, I think this is a missed opportunity. So really, we think and argue in the book that there's 3 levels that LIS students should get training in, and that's understanding information literacy, the practice for themselves, so critically examining what they're doing and how they're interacting with information, and then how to teach and advocate, and that would be teaching people how to practice information literacy and advocate for or against ways that people can either get better access to information literacy training or against the barriers that they might encounter. So speaking of barriers, what are the barriers to the practice of lifelong information literacy, and how might those barriers be mitigated? So lack of time, that one's pretty obvious. A lot of times we take shortcuts in trying to find answers, and sometimes that's okay. And I think that's another thing that we need to get across as librarians, that as we're talking to people about information literacy, we understand that there is it differs in terms of importance. How much time you need to put into the practice of information literacy. If you're sitting in your living room arguing with people over who the actor is in that movie, I mean, okay, use the first answer on the Google search, use ChatGPT, whatever, because the answer doesn't really matter. It's not that important. If you are a person writing an article, or if you're doing a homework assignment, those are a little bit more important. You need to pay a little bit more attention to whether or not you've gotten the correct answer. So I think more than just helping people understand how to practice information literacy, it's also teaching them how to weigh the importance of how much time to spend with this practice. Lack of motivation, this feeds into what I was just talking about. You may be more or less motivated depending on how important your question is. But I think we also need to think about why people are not motivated even when it is important. So why are our students in K-12 or whenever, why are they taking shortcuts? And I think sometimes it's because they don't understand the technology itself. They don't really understand that what they're losing by doing that technology is hurting them in the long run. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have with everyone, with our students, with our colleagues, is that technology can be a really useful, really good thing. But even if, let's say, ChatGPT can summarize information for you really well, that's something it does well. What are you losing by using that to summarize instead of doing it yourself? And how, again, might that impact you in the future and your brain and how it works? So letting people think about for themselves and how important it is for themselves to get correct information and to do the work themselves, I think is a good path to motivation. And then finally, just teaching people how to understand technology and what's going on, it can be really important. People often, and I will admit, I don't always understand exactly what's going on when a Google search spits out information. There's complicated algorithms that work there. And without explicitly stating that it's an information literacy practice, teaching people about the technology itself can make them more motivated, because they'll see the weaknesses in the various technologies that they're using. And then we also talk quite extensively in the book about society and community events and how that impacts people's practices of information literacy. So one of the questions we brought up is, how might librarians begin to bring together a polarized society, and why is it a responsibility of librarians at all? And just to answer this in the shortest way I possibly can, particularly that last part, why it's a responsibility of librarians, is that we need to do it because we're positioned best out of almost anybody in our society to be able to operate as a means of helping people practice their information literacy. Aside from public education, we're one of the last community spaces that brings together people with different ideas and from different backgrounds. Additionally, we do have a position of trust for the most part in our communities. And I think we can leverage that as a means of starting these conversations and amplifying other people's voices in how they're understanding their practice and what they're concerned about. The other issue, and the other reason why this is so important, is that polarization itself it's a barrier to information literacy. If you're automatically viewing any source that you read through a lens of, is this conservative or is this liberal, you're likely missing out on good information and often the correct information. So I would argue that in a polarized society, you're going to have a very difficult time, a highly polarized society, you're going to have a difficult time practicing information literacy to the best of your ability. And then finally, democratic institutions require a functioning electorate and an educated electorate. And if we don't engage in this argument, if we don't engage in this action, it is likely that democratic functions will continue to be eroded. And, quite frankly, authoritarian governments don't particularly want you to be practicing information literacy. They want you to be understanding information that they're putting out. So it's really critical, I think, on both an existential level and also just on our position in our community and wanting to improve the community. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Paul with technology and information literacy, expanding a little bit on what I mentioned before.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm Paul Jaeger. I'm a professor and distinguished scholar teacher at the University of Maryland. And I'm just going to be picking up some of the things that at this point everyone else has been talking about in various ways. The idea that literacy is always a moving target is really, really important at this point. So the question that came earlier about, the distinguishing between literacy assessments designed for a print-based world versus an electronic-based world, it is part of it, but it's also really essential to remember that everything is always changing at this point. The constant technological churn of familiar sources of information, the addition of new sources of information, the change in ownership of familiar sources of information, the constant creation of new sources of information. Literacy for everyone is about continual learning. And that the lifelong part of it is, it's not just important throughout your life. Because of the way technology works now, it's something you're going to have to keep learning forever and always. And helping people understand this perpetual growth, perpetual change in terms of sorting through the information that's there is a really important part of helping people prepare to keep engaging this. And the fact that no matter how much education in the area they get, they'll have to be constantly assessing new sources of information, new platforms, as things keep coming along and changing how they're structured. If you've been using the internet long enough to remember when social media was new, the few things that survive from then are very different now. And most of the things that were launched in the early years of that or any time since are long since gone. And when we see something really significant come along as a change, like AI in its generative iteration, it's a whole new set of evaluative skills that people need to learn. One thing Natalie and I work on, other than writing books that start with the word foundation, is co-editing the journal Library Quarterly. And every journal editor out there right now is dealing with getting submissions that are clearly partly written by AI, or all the citations were added using AI, and you find these amazing things where someone who is in a very high-ranking position, someone who is very knowledgeable, has submitted a paper that has all the citations are completely made up by the technology. None of them exist. And so as far as we've reached the point where you're always a learner, that is an amazing example. On the next slide, this is actually one of two questions that were submitted before the talk that we picked up because they fit with what our book talks about. But dealing with information disappearing or being altered on government websites, how do you talk about that? It's actually being done right now with a very high level of enthusiasm, but it's actually not a new technology. It's not a new approach to this technology. So when e-government was a new thing in the 90s, saving stuff wasn't really thought all that much about initially under the Clinton administration. And NARA archived some stuff when it changed to the George W. Bush administration. But they were very active in removing things that they didn't like, didn't agree with their policy positions. And very quickly, the footprint of the US government online got so big that NARA gave up trying to save everything. So there is actually an impermanence to a lot of the US government presence online. Often things are lost just simply through lack of awareness or a project ending and a website being neglected. But the active removal of a bunch of stuff right now is certainly a more aggressive variation on that. And so partly contextualizing it as this is something we as citizens need to be cognizant of is a really important part of talking about literacy. From the standpoint of if you think of literacy as a basic right, then that right requires to fully, to be fully meaningful, that important information not just disappear. And so things like what a government creates, some of the statistical resources that have disappeared recently, for example, are a lot of community information about the demographics of the US. That's important stuff. And so simply helping people be aware of how important these are and that they can disappear, and then helping them with awareness of what are other sources that provide the information, who's trying to save it, who's trying to make it available in other ways, is a way of helping people still be able to reach it. And then finally, the question about integrity of information. And in the context of government censorship, again, things disappearing, things being removed from collections, how do you help people not give up? I think was the main point of this question that was submitted. And thinking about it in terms of helping people see literacy not just as some sort of blunt tool, but as something precious. And also historically, how perilous it has been. Natalie mentioned authoritarians having very clear views on what they want you reading. That is something that has been a constant as long as there has been literacy going back thousands and thousands of years BC. The earliest records we have of written languages, leaders are censoring what they don't want out there. There even was attempts to rewrite history even when history was first being recorded in written form. So this is a really important thing to find ways to communicate to people, is the idea that you can't take this for granted. You can't just say, oh, well, to censorship, to the quality of information. These are central things to an individual user and to a whole society. And ultimately, if you think about the word education, its root is a Latin word, to lead out. And if you can help people, if you can help lead them away from the disinformation and the misinformation and the, oh, well, I give up nature that is so much of the internet, you're really going to be equipping them with a vital life skill that will help with that being a continual learner and always assessing and seeing literacy really as a lifelong skill.
And I think with that, we can open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Paul and Natalie. We do have a few questions. The first one is on assessment, are there great resources for ideas on culturally sensitive acceptance of alternative metrics for demonstrating success?
I'm sorry, can you run that by again? What are alternative methods for understanding success for practicing information literacy? Is that?
The person is wondering about culturally sensitive acceptance of alternative metrics.
Oh, okay. Sorry, missed that part. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part and parcel of the getting away from the checklist model and having it be more of a conversational, leading people to the information and getting them there. And I think, one of the best ways to do that is to talk with them about all the things that they've learned that have been passed down, through generations, whether it be in their personal lives or, historically speaking, or, any of those kinds of things. So, yeah, I don't know, Paul, do you have something to add?
No, that was a really good answer.
And I
Thanks,
apologize.
Natalie. The next question from Madeline is, do you believe that universal design for learning has a place in the MLIS curriculum?
Yes.
Do you believe it should be a mandatory requirement for MLIS students to learn? She states that it is often offered for professional development among faculty who teach credit-bearing classes.
Yeah, I think it absolutely should be required. I mean, I know it was in my MLIS. I teach it in my teaching information literacy course. We also teach it in, I'm trying to think, several of our electives as part of our program at the University of South Florida. I believe it's in even our foundational course. So yeah, definitely a huge proponent of that. I mean, I don't know how we can view ourselves as educators without understanding that people learn in different ways and have different needs.
And we've got a couple of compliments on your presentation and on the content of your book. So look forward to having some additional readers, and Julie and Joette soon. Okay, thanks again, Paul and Natalie. In our last presentation of this afternoon,
Thank you.
Laura Millar, who is the author of A Matter of Facts, The Value of Evidence in an Information Age. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much. Just queuing up my presentation here. Come along. From beginning. Thank you, everyone. I am delighted to be here. I am the oldie here, old timer chronologically, and my book is older than the other ones. But I'm also really excited to share some thoughts about evidence and archives in the realm of information literacy, particularly following up on Paul and Natalie, because Paul's comments about not taking integrity for granted, not taking it for granted that the facts are in there in the information. So what I want to do is talk a bit about my book, A Matter of Facts, The Value of Evidence in an Information Age, which tries to create the language for people to help them understand why archives are different from information, why we need to look at them as materials that don't just happen. They don't just exist. They're not just old. And in a digital world, we absolutely require much more vigilance than ever to protect evidence and to make it accessible and to support the institutions that look after evidence. And in that, I use the term evidence literacy, which is in essence the same as information literacy with that one word changed, evidence. This definition from the ALA is not as nuanced as Natalie and Paul's definition, but in essence, it's the idea of being able to recognize when you need information or evidence, find it, evaluate it, and use it effectively. So then, well, what's different then between evidence and information? And why does that matter? And the difference really is entirely around the trustworthiness of the evidence, which requires that it be understood in its context. So I'm going to use an example of genealogy, because what I find is it's really important to find language that helps people, whether they're researchers or students or librarian colleagues who are trying to communicate to people and say, why is it that you don't find archives in the reference room of the library? and you can't take them out. What's going on here? The language is really important. We need to tell stories. We need to explain in ways that make sense to people. And genealogy is one of the ways that I find a lot of people really understand the difference between information and evidence. Genealogy, family history, family photographs, they are not the stuff I work on now. I work on government record-keeping policies for a digital age, what Paul talked about government websites. That's the world I live in. But where I find the greatest growth in people's understanding is when I talk to them about what matters to them. Their family pictures, their family stories, their community stories, going back to what Lauren and Julie said about community archives. So if you had a book on how to conduct genealogy, somebody like me with an Irish and English heritage, that book, if it's got Irish and English examples, would be fabulous. But if my ancestors came from Thailand and Ghana, it won't be so helpful. So I have to say to people, you're going to find your stories in different places, depending on your own family history. And the books may take you so far, but the evidence is going to get you where you need to be. And the difference then is trustworthiness. So something happens, an act happens and a fact results. It rains, I get wet. The information is that I'm wet. The record is a picture of me, not just wet, but when it's raining. If it's just wet, somebody could have dumped a bucket on my head and I could be wet and nobody would know that it was because it was raining. So the evidence is that which is left that we can continue to trust over and over and over again as giving us an evidence-based truth. And this goes to Paul's comment about the removal of evidence reduces our ability to trust the institutions that are supposed to be creating it and preserving it on our behalf. So then people say, well, what do I care about archives? And when I talk to you here, I want to help you find the language to tell people why these things matter so much. I see three reasons: accountability, identity, and memory. Accountability is holding someone, government, institution, or person responsible for an action they took or a decision they made. And the evidence stands as proof. The archives, the records, the photographs, the reports, they stand as proof. The other is identity, personal identity or collective identity. I'm an American born in Seattle, raised in Connecticut, been living in Canada so long, I say sorry to my ATM machine. And how do I prove that? How do I prove that I have American citizenship and Canadian citizenship? I need archives to prove that for me. And how do I help foster individual and shared memories? How do I have my family memories or memories of an activity I was involved in? I can only do that if I have some sort of proof outside of my own memory, because it doesn't always work as well as we want. So I want to take you now into an example that I hope will show you what I mean when I talk about this, what the impact of the digital age is, and what it is that we as librarians and archivists and information professionals can do to help the public understand why not just information is important, but evidence is important. So this fuzzy document is an official government record that confirms that my grandfather, Thomas Annandale Millar, you can barely see his name there, crossed the border from Canada to the United States on May the 4th in 1943. Now, he was serving with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he went down to the United States on military business during the Second World War. This is a piece of proof. This is a piece of proof that holds my grandfather accountable. He had to carry it with him to prove he had a right to be in the United States. It holds the government accountable for allowing him into the United States. It also proves his identity as an RCAF officer. And it helps me have memories of him. He died when I was 4 years old, but now I can say, yes, he lived in Alma Court in Vancouver. He was 5'8" tall, which is why my brothers and I are all so short. He had an appendix scar. He came to Canada on the SS Dominion in 1907. This is all proof, but it's only proof if I can trust it. So how do I trust it? Why is trustworthiness so important? I have to be able to believe that the US government's Immigration and Naturalization Service, which created that crossing record, did the right job. that it was accurate, that it was complete. I then have to trust that the National Archives didn't change that record over time. They hold it today. I have to trust that it still remains there, safe and stable. I have to trust that when it was digitized and made available online, that nothing changed in that process. Nothing was tampered with, or that there wasn't anything blurred. So I then have to look at other sources of evidence to say, does it change any of my story? Here's his obituary record in the newspaper. There's the passenger list for the ship he came on. This is 1909, but the passenger list he came on was 1907. Then the other side shows the actual registration of him coming to Canada. I need all these sources together so I can triangulate them and understand what it is that actually happened. When we are explaining to people why evidence matters, we can't just say, trust the first document you find in a Google search. We have to say, make sure it came from a trustworthy source. Make sure it has been preserved and protected over time so that it still remains safe and stable with its integrity intact so that we can use it. Now, what happens in the digital age? All hell breaks loose, basically. We are consumed with issues of artificial intelligence right now, and it's a real challenge. But we've had disinformation for centuries. Everybody knows the story of H.G. Wells' story of the alien invasion war of the worlds. It became the radio play. It later became a movie. It terrified people when the radio play came out in 1938, and it was fake news. It was fake news. It was a fiction created by Orson Welles for fun in his mind, but it didn't go down that way. Did Queen Elizabeth actually dance? Somebody has created an image of her doing this. So how do we trust this? How do we say to people, check your sources, check that it's authentic, check that it's accurate? Now, I go back to genealogy and family history for this with this record. In April, I had to go to England. I shouldn't say had to, I was delighted to go. But I had to apply for a visa to cross the border. Never had to do that before. This time I had to apply for a visa. This is the record I got as an email. It says, you look middle of the screen there, your approval may have been automated. AI was used to generate the approval for my application to cross into the UK. And if you look at the bottom, it says my ETA, my visa, is linked to my passport, but it's not linked to my physical passport. It's linked to my digital passport. I have absolutely no way, aside from this email, to prove that I had the right to cross the border, that I had the right to be in the UK. How do I actually prove that now for accountability for me or for the UK government to say we gave her the right to go in? I can't do that without my digital passport, which I have no control over. And how do I share with my granddaughter? I don't have one yet, but there you go. How do I share with my granddaughter that once upon a time in 2025, Grandma Laura went to the UK? I cannot do that. I can only do that by other documents, by my photographs, by my written records, by my emails. They're all digital. They're all digital. So what are we doing? What is the archivist doing? Traditionally, we worked with the old stuff. We were only allowed to work with the old stuff. And now we have to get in there at the moment of creation. We have to change completely our role and say we need to be there when that website is created, when that statistical database is created, to say it must be preserved. It must be kept with its integrity and its authenticity, and it must be transparent. But the problem is the people aren't letting us in the room. The people who make decisions are not letting us in the room, or they are actually taking our jobs away, and they are actually taking our funding away and our institutions away. So we need to keep fighting and fighting and fighting. And this is where information and evidence are different, because information is constantly changing, and some of that change is good. Evidence needs to remain safe, stable, authentic, reliable, and accessible so that we can always go back to the source, to the proof behind the story. And what we need to do then, and I ask you to join me, I know you joined me already, is to help explain this difference between information and evidence and say, within all the realm of literacy that we are trying to achieve, there is this one area of how can you actually trust when a piece of evidence is telling you an evidence-based truth. So the language I use is forward thinking. It's popular. I try to tell people stories that make it resonate with them. And I encourage you to do the same. This goes back to comments about storytelling. Amanda talked about using examples. I use a lot of examples in my presentations. One I like to tell about is I was crossing the border to give a speech at Yale. So I'm crossing the flight border from Montreal into the flight. And the customs official didn't know why I was going. He says, "What do I care? What do I care about archives?" He said. And what I said is, "Do you have children?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "How old are your children?" He said, 5 and 7. And I said, "Do you have photographs of your children?" And he said, "Of course I do." And I said, "Where are they?" And he said, "They're on my phone." And I leaned over the desk and I said, "How do you know they're really there?" And he said, "That's what you're going to do?" I said, "Yes, I'm going to make sure people like you know your photographs are really there." And he said, "Off you go, do your job." So how can we get people to tell stories, to understand why it matters to them so much? And from that, I think we can take them back to, why is a government website important? Why is a government report important? Why is staffing of NARA crucially important? So to end, what advice can we provide to the public? We can help them advocate for stronger records and evidence laws, regulations, and processes. We can help them be strategic and thoughtful about how their own records are made, about how their government's records are made, and about how they are kept. We need people to realize archives don't just happen. They are filled with bias and change and all sorts of peculiarities, particularly in the decisions about what should or shouldn't get kept. And we need the public to be engaged in that process. And we need to help people realize the importance of promoting archival institutions, libraries, special collections agencies, and any other organization that exists on behalf of society to preserve and make available those sources of evidence, whether they're within a library environment or in a separate institution. We need to give people the understanding of the importance, and we need to help empower them to feel they do have a voice and they do have a right to participate. And with that, I will say thank you, and I'll look forward to any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful. We have a couple of questions from Madeline. Do you believe all archives should be digitized, given what you shared in the last several minutes? And what should become of the tangible evidence once they are digitized, or once it is digitized?
Excellent question, and I'll give you a provocative answer. No, I don't. 99% of what is created today is digital. 99% of the world's information now is digital, because we have so much being generated now compared to 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And a lot of what is not digitized because there's so much sensitivity around personal information or private information. Digitizing it would make it easier to access, but so few people need to access it that to me is a very poor use of time and energy. I believe that what's missing is the focus on the born digital, which will disappear in a heartbeat if we push the wrong button and blow up our cloud servers. So I often recommend to my archival colleagues when I do consultancies, don't focus on getting through all the analog backlog. Pick those materials that are high use so that people can get them with self-access, and don't worry about the rest. Get to it if and when you have time, and think hard about privacy implications and security implications. Don't worry about it otherwise. Focus on the born digital, which will be lost. And as an example, I have about 6 photographs of my grandfather, who I mentioned in my talk today. On my phone, and I'm an archivist, I have 12,000 photographs. So digitizing 6 pictures of my grandfather is fun, cleaning up my phone of 12,000 pictures is more important. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Great advice to end today's webinar on. Thanks again to all our presenters for joining us today and sharing some thoughts from both their books and from their more recent knowledge acquired. Again, all of the books will be shipping, if they're not already available, by the end of this month. Rob has graciously dropped a link or information about a code for purchasing the books at discount of $10 off. It's very rare for us with textbooks. Use code ILMW25 on the aliastore.ala.org website in order to buy those books for $10 off through Saturday of this week. If you want to watch this recording again, or if you missed any portions of it, it can be accessed as early as this afternoon on the main American Library Association YouTube page. I'll look for it maybe in the next 3 hours or so. If you want to join us for other events, we typically list them in alaeditions.org/events. And we do have one coming up on August 4th, collection development tips for all librarians, which I think some of you are already signed up for. That'll be a great one with just a couple of presenters, and we look forward to having as many of you as we can again there and just share. Otherwise, looking forward to announcing our programming for this upcoming fall and winter in the next month or two. And I will see and chat with you all again. Enjoy a slideshow of our other recent titles and those that were discussed today coming up as we close out now. Bye all.
Thank you, Ramon. I'm logging off now.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks all.